Welcome to Art Appreciation, Chapter 13. This is Architecture. So this is our final chapter, as I mentioned before, on um, medium for art, different types of art. We've covered a wide range over the last several chapters, and today is architecture. So we don't always think of architecture in the art world. You may not always think of it that way. It kind of feels like a separate thing, but it's very closely related to art and design. And so we'll just go through some of these basic types today, and you can get some visuals of what these different types of architecture look like. The types of structural systems that we're going to go over are load-bearing, post and lintel, bracket set, round arch and vault, pointed arch and vault, dome, corbelled arch, vault and dome, cast iron, balloon frame, steel frame, suspension and cable stayed, reinforced concrete, and geodesic dome. I don't have on this list, which I probably should have. The very last thing we'll look at is sustainable architecture at the end of the chapter. So what is the purpose of architecture? Every structure is designed to serve a specific function. We evaluate a structure according to how it fulfills its purpose. This kind of goes on the heels of the previous chapter because the previous chapter was about functional things as well. They were objects that we use for ritual or cultural purposes, for ceremonies, or just for living daily life. And we looked at how those are artistic creations as well. Now we're looking at architecture that is also designed for a very specific function. And its success, or how good it is how well it fulfills that purpose. But you'll see very quickly, there is definitely an artistic and aesthetic side to architecture. And really that's design. Like how is it designed, both form and function. So we talk about structure a lot with architecture. The structural systems in architecture, we have two basic systems. You'll want to make sure you get all these notes down so you have reference to all the different kinds. You may want to doodle some examples and drawings of the basic structures as we look at them. Sometimes there's diagrams, sometimes there's just a building that represents this type of structure we're talking about. So the first one is a shell system. It is one material for support and sheathing. Now we'll talk about sheathing. That will become a word that I just use probably as we go through this chapter, and that just means the outside covering of something. So it's not two things. The support and the sheathing is just one thing. So, and you can remember that like a shell. Think of a sea animal or a snail living inside of its shell. That's its whole home. It's its whole building that it lives in. And it's made out of one material, the shell material. So that's kind of how it helps me remember that. Probably why it's called that. And then the second type is skeleton and skin system, which is kind of also referencing the body. So you can think about this as there is a strong frame on the inside, like our skeleton is our strong frame on the inside, covered by sheathing, which is our skin, or basically your skin. You could think of all the other parts of our body like muscles and tendons and all that system as well, but basically think of it as skeleton and skin. If we didn't have our skeletons, we would just be a pile of skin on the floor, a pile of shapeless material. Same thing with architecture. With architecture, if you didn't have the inside frame on buildings, and you just, or think of a house, if you didn't have the inside structure of the house made of wood, then you just have a pile of vinyl siding laying on the ground. So two factors that determine success of any structural system are weight and tensile strength. How much weight is this building going to have? And this is going to cover everything from small little houses and primitive adobe buildings to skyscrapers. So this, no matter what we're talking about and what time period we're talking about, an architect has to consider the weight of the building and the tensile strength. So weight makes sense, I'm sure, but what is tensile strength? That is the amount of stretching stress, that's called tensile, or I think of it as like the span. If you're picturing two posts with a thing over the top of them, that's the span of it. So how much stretching stress a material can withstand before it bends or breaks. And we will reference tensile strength as we go through some of these types of architecture. So make sure you get all these definitions down. So back to the first type, we have load-bearing construction. Or I shouldn't have said the first type, it's just one of the examples that we have of architecture. So the different ones I'm about to show you will either fit into the category of shell system or skeleton and skin system. And this is our first example. It is also called stacking and piling. It's the most simple method of making a building. Layer is piled upon layer, getting gradually thinner towards the top. And this is, I have in parentheses, shell, because it is under the main category of shell system. An adobe house or building is a construction using sun-dried bricks and coated with mud plaster. So that would be an example of this type of construction. We often think of adobe as very small, kind of hut-like buildings in maybe more simple communities or Native American structure, and that's true, but there are some pretty complex ones in the world. This is one example of that. This is the Great Friday Mosque in Mali, and it's actually rebuilt in 1907 in the style of a 13th century original. But what you have here is a fantastic example of complex adobe structure. This is constructed of sun-dried brick coated with mud plaster. The walls of the mosque have a plastic, kind of like sculptural quality. They look smooth and rounded, don't they? The photograph here shows well the gentle tapering of the walls imposed by the construction technique, as well as the small size of windows that illuminate the covered prayer hall inside. The protruding wooden poles serve to anchor the scaffolding that is erected every few years so the workers can restore the mosque's smooth coating of mud plaster. So those aren't actually structural things, those things sticking out. That is so they can put boards on the laying over those poles sticking out, and then they can redo the mud layering. Because if you think about it, that's going to wear down. Wind, I don't suppose a lot of rain, but some rain. And so it does erode and go away over time because it's just smeared with mud. But they have to maintain that and repair it. These at the top are very high, but they put boards across here, and then they can rework those parts. And then they reference the windows. Notice how small the windows are. Because the bigger the window, the less structural integrity of the wall. If you can think about that, these are this is all built. The whole support is the wall, is what it's made out of. It has to be solid and strong, or it's not going to be very able to stand up. And you can see how the whole thing slightly tips inward because the thickness of the wall down here at the bottom is thicker than the thickness up here at the top, even in this area. And it has to be made that way because it has to get a little bit lighter as it goes up, as is the definition of a shell construction or system. Okay, so that's an example of adobe, a shell system. Also, we call that load-bearing construction / stacking and piling. So make sure you understand all the categories that this fits into. The next type of construction is called post and lintel. They call this an elementary construction method because it's very basic as well. You have two vertical uprights called the posts, supported by a horizontal crosspiece, the lintel. And isn't that what you do when you are a little kid building with blocks? That's kind of the main way that we start to build something. Or even if you have a deck of cards and you're trying to build a house out of cards, like if you used to play with cards, you want to put two horizontal or verticals and then a horizontal on top to create a structure that way. So it's just a very basic way to build something. We see a lot of ancient architecture built this way. And we call specifically hypostyle is a large hall constructed using post and lintel. And there's many examples of that. When you're using materials like heavy stone, brick, primarily stone, in order to support a stone crossbeam on top, the lintel, you have to have pretty stout vertical posts. And so this hypostyle that I'm about to show you an example of can also be called a virtual forest of columns, and you'll see why. So this is an example of a hypostyle temple. It is post and lintel, so let's think about all the things that this categorizes as. This would be considered a shell system because one material is the support and the sheathing, outside covering. There isn't really an outside covering here, is there? This is just columns, basically, with some big supports on top. So it creates like an interior space that you can walk in through here, but there's not very much space between those posts, is there? They're very close together because they have to support the weight of those beams on top. And so this from here to here is the span between the posts, and that would be where we consider the tensile strength. How much weight can that support before this is going to crash down between them? And that's engineering. So this is ancient engineering of how much space can we put these. Someone had to figure out how much space could go between these posts before this would not be able to support itself and it would fall. Ancient Egyptians would create stylized things like these posts with the design on them, with like plant type design on them. They sometimes like the swamp. They thought of it like the primal swamp of creation. And so that it's part of their belief system that the first mound of dry land arose at the dawn of the world. And so this kind of made a connection between that. So they would do like these versions of plants that grew up in the marshes of the Nile. So it's actually kind of a reflection of their belief system as well, and then like what they were familiar with, like the marshes of the swamps around the Nile in Egypt. In ancient Greece, we have another type of column that reflects their culture and style. Greek architects developed and codified three major architectural styles, roughly in sequence. We know them as what's called the Greek orders, and that's what's listed there on your screen, Greek orders of columns. The most distinctive feature of each was the design of the column. So this kind of shows a time period. We start with Doric, which has no base. So here's our Doric column here. It has no base at the bottom. It just goes straight into the ground or the floor of the building. And then the capital, which is the top part here, is bell shaped. If you look, it's kind of like on its, like a bell on its side or upside down. You could think of it like an upside down bell. Then we have the Ionic, which has a stepped base. And at the top, we have these two spirals that come out called volutes. And this is, every Ionic column is going to have this style thing at the top. It's very identifiable. Actually, all three types are identifiable. So you just have to kind of remember the sequence of them. And they represent a time period. Early, middle, and then lastly, we have the latest one, called the Corinthian column. And at the base down here, you can see, so the base has these stepped pieces, just like the Ionic column, the shaft, and then the capital up here has elaborated sculpted leaves. As you can see, they're like each little individual leaf bending over. And those are acanthus leaves. So these different columns are from different time periods, as I said. The first one is like the 7th century BCE. The Ionic would have been like the 6th century BCE, and the Corinthian is the 4th. So every 1 to 2 years in Greek architecture, you see this changing, and so that identifies what time period they were from. And that's again called the Greek order of columns. So we have a few other words over here, and if you want to just draw in your notes kind of a simple column, the top piece up here is called the cornice. This flat middle piece, they always have this flat middle piece. This is just the typical layout for the top of a Greek architecture building. I'm gonna just try to show you. Oops, I don't want that fat one. Like right here is just the cornice. This straight piece here is the frieze, and a lot of times that would have decorative things on it, like even carved relief sculptures. There's a word we learned earlier, relief sculptures. This one has some detail, but they might even put like scenes of men fighting battles and different things on there. Then you have the architrave, this section, which also could have images and scenes carved into it. The capital, every column has the long part called the shaft, which does get smaller as it goes up. And then you have the base. Except on the Doric, you don't actually have a base. Okay, so a little bit more with this post and lintel Greek style. Some more terminology. The entablature consists of 3 basic elements. The things I just went through. The architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. And you can see this whole, how it arranges it here. This is a little bit more zoomed out, but that represents what we call the entablature. Architrave, frieze, where you would as this shows, you would have that relief sculpture happening there. The cornice, and then this is also considered part of the cornice up here. This piece right here, so it's like a shelf-like thing. And then the pediment is obviously this triangle shape that forms the roof. The entablature supports a triangular element called the pediment. So this is actually a drawing, as you see, and we call that an elevation, showing the side view of the Temple of Athena, Nike. That is where the word Nike comes from. I better clarify, I think I said on the other slide that this could have scenes on it too. It doesn't have sculptures, it just has rows of these kind of bands, like this says here. Architrave, sorry, unadorned band of lintels above columns. But the frieze is where you would typically have the imagery and relief sculpture. So make sure you get all those definitions down and understand, and you can sketch out a little picture of like kind of like what you have here. You don't have to get all of this, but like this part here at least, so you know what these different aspects look like. And which one is this? Look at the column top. Do you remember what that one's called? That's the Ionic. And I always think of it like it looks like an eye to me. Oops. I have a mouse that wants to move to different slides quicker. So this looks like the top of an eye. It doesn't have the curly thing at the bottom, but that makes me think of an eye. Doric looks like a D laying on its side. It's the bell, remember, but that kind of looks like the letter D laying on its side, kind of, and backwards. And then I just remember Corinthian is the longest word and the fanciest sounding word, and it has the most fancy top on it. That's my way for remembering those three. Okay, so yes, this one is Ionic, example of Ionic columns as well. Switching to a totally different culture, we're talking about now Chinese and Japanese architecture, and they had this thing called a bracket system. It's still post and lintel, but it allowed for a wider span between the columns and a lot of weight to be put on the columns. The Chinese and Japanese architects used clusters of interlocking wooden brackets and arms to crown the top of columns to create gracefully curved roofs. So here we go. All of these things have aesthetic qualities that we've talked about so far. We talk about, if you recall at the very beginning of this chapter, that when we talk of architecture, we're talking the success of it. Like, does it do what it's supposed to do? And designers of architecture are doing both things. They are designing it to make it functional and usable and serve the purpose that they need it for, whether it's housing or worship or whatever. But you have to admit that no matter what, they are always using aesthetics and what is pleasing to look at, what is making it more beautiful or more interesting artistically. Even back, I'm clicking back real fast to this one. Yes, it's Adobe. Yes, it's the most simple, primitive type of structure, but these probably have meaning, these pointy things on top. But at the same time, that's design. They're using repetition. They're using balance. They're using just interest in trying to make it look interesting. These probably serve a function that these vertical posts are here. Maybe there's more stability by putting these vertical things. But at the same time, they make it balanced and symmetrical and rhythmic and repetition. All those things that that create art and design. And why do these go up taller in this part? Why do these three stick up taller like that? Maybe I can't tell from this view, but perhaps this one's a little bit taller than these two. Well, that's to create a pleasing balanced effect, right? So no matter what time period or even simple, primitive, basic architecture, you're going to see design and creativity because that's what we do when we make things. Okay, and so back down to this bracket set, I just wanted to give a side note of remember to think about that as we go through everything. Form and function, both things are happening at the same time. You can see how it's built this way. So you have these cross beams that are sitting on the column. Here's another view of it. Here's that cross beam sitting on the column. And that is complex to look at. I know it's hard to see what you're seeing, but if you can just kind of envision it like this, there's a beam sitting on the main beams, the vertical, there's a horizontal sitting on the verticals. There's your post and lintel, right? Then you have another beam sitting this way that goes back and a cross beam this way and a little one and a cross beam going this way. So it's creating this stepped effect. And then that allows for this curving roof. That's what they were seeking. And so here's an example of a post and lintel Japanese building with bracket sets. And you can see that gives you that very interesting, graceful, curved shaped roof. It almost looks like it's floating or flipping up on the ends. Actually, I think that is flipping up on the ends. I think it is going up a little higher. I can't tell. But you can definitely see post and lintel structure in there, even in just looking at this courtyard area right here. All made with post and lintels. And there's a bracket and a bracket and a bracket. And you can see they get some space between the posts that way. Flipping back to the previous slide, this is the Byodo-in Temple in Uji, Japan from the Heian period. But I forgot to point this out. Interlocking wooden brackets and arms to crown the top of columns to create gracefully curved roofs. That's important. It's underlined, so it's probably a test question somewhere. Allow 5 times the weight on the column. Why is that? How is it allowing 5 times the weight on the column? Can you think in an engineering way or in a physics way why that would be? Well, the answer is that it's spreading the weight out. It's distributing the weight out over the tinsel area, the span between the posts. And so therefore not as much weight is going directly down into the columns. It's spreading that weight out, which leaves less pressure on this. So they can be further apart and they can support more weight. So our next one type of architecture is called round arch and vault. The round arch and vault is constructed of wedge-shaped stones that meet at an angle perpendicular to the curve of the arch. It uses the forces of tension and compression. Stability is created by the topmost stone called the keystone. And don't worry about this right now. We're going to talk about barrel vault in a second. So the easiest way to describe this is just to show you a picture of it, which I will. But go ahead and copy this definition down. And remember that the forces of tension and compression are what hold it strong. Here are a couple of examples of the round arch and vault. This is actually just the round arch, actually. So it had been created as far back as Mesopotamian cultures, but it's really most used by the Romans. So what you see here is the Ponce de Garde in Nimes, France, and this is actually a Roman structure that's still here 2,000 years old. It's just amazing that it's here. This was an aqueduct that would carry water over these bridge type things. And the Romans had a very elaborate system of aqueducts. This one actually has 3 tiers. And it goes very slightly downhill so that it would carry water downhill to make it go in the direction they wanted it to. In the lowest level there, you see the one on the bottom is actually a footbridge that you could cross, use to walk. It's actually something that cyclists today use in the Tour de France, by the way. So a more modern example of an arch like this is the arch in St. Louis. And if you've ever watched anything about the construction or seen images about the construction of the arch, it shows you how they built these sides up first. And the very last piece they put in was this keystone at the very top. And once that's in place, then the entire strength of those 2 rising sides is locked in place. It's using that same engineering concept as the early Romans used. All strength and structure is based on that keystone. So these are examples of the Roman arch. And then when you talk about a vault, we have a barrel vault, and then we have what in that it creates a nave. We have a groin vault, and then we have a bay. So let's look at what these are talking about, examples of these. The barrel vault is a series of arches placed flush together. So picture 100 St. Louis arches side by side touching as they go back in space, and that creates like a tunnel, like an interior large space. And so that is called, that tunnel or long central area is called the nave. So before I go to the next definitions, I'm going to show you that. This would be like a barrel vault and nave. Now there's arches built within these barrel walls. So it's a very complex structure, but if you look up here at the top, you can see how these are just one row of arches stacked right next to each other, and it creates this huge, tall, open space on the inside. And that's what we call the nave. So then it's like this would represent, I wish we could see the top of this picture, but these would also go all the way up like an arch. But then within that, you have these side arches built into it. So it's pretty complicated. Looks like we have some columns here too that might be doing some structural things. But this part in particular, you can see how row after row of arch is going to give you this barrel vault with nave. And so this is the same thing. If you'll look at this, you can see how that creates the barrel vault. Also makes sense why it's called that, right? It's like the barrel of a gun. Let me go back to the previous slide now. So a groin vault is the result of 2 barrel vaults crossed at right angles to each other. The weight and stress is channeled down to the 4 corners. And a bay is the space created by 1 groin vault. So let me go back to this. If you have these things written down, you can see again. This, what they've dotted out here, is that space created by this one and this one intersecting. Two barrel vaults intersecting creates a bay on the inside. And when you have two barrels intersecting, we call that a groin vault. So hopefully all that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward when you look at it in a diagram. They just build on complexity a little bit. So actually in this one, if this continues on out, that might be a groin vault there. I'm not sure, I can't see, but get the idea. Then we have a pointed arch and vault. The pointed arch and vault arcs up to a point. Makes sense? One is rounded and one is pointed. This allows weight to channel down at a steeper angle, creating a taller arch. It's reinforced with ribs to create stability. And these are some different things that create reinforcements. Buttresses, piers, and flying buttresses. The ribs are part of the actual vault, but these are actually exterior things that are added to these buildings to create stability. So when we're talking about any of these, really, the barrel vault, the groin vault, those are all things that we oftentimes see on old architecture that's like cathedrals and churches and things. These that we're about to look at are some of the greatest, largest, tallest cathedrals in all of Europe. And they were built only because of this type of architecture allowed for such height. So let's look at these and see if you can see what's happening here. So very similar to what we just looked at, you have these tall walls that go up to the arch, right? But do you see how they're pointed at the top? So that's called the pointed arch, and you can get more height because, again, it's a physics thing. Like the weight is not going out here, it's going tapered down. So more is directly pushed straight down. Therefore, it can support more height. When it's rounded, more of the pressure goes here, and there's only so far you can go tall before you're going to push your walls out. But this style just redirects the weight. It channels the weight straight down the sides. Now, these things are called ribs. They're kind of like intentionally heavier duty sections or arches built into the overall structure that is thicker and heavier, gives it its support from the inside. So back here, I'm going to click back to the previous slide. Those are reinforced with ribs. Makes sense. It's not, kind of looks like our ribs, right? Holding our body, protecting our lungs. So those are ribs. And then here's an example of the different types of supports from the outside. So that's important. Make sure you understand. Some support from the inside or part of the structure, these ribs. Others support from the outside. So here's your basic, I'm going to draw on it. Here's your basic structure. You've got, whoa, that's bad. Let me redo that. You've got your column here, your column here, and the main thing is coming, this is the main interior arch that's built similar to a round Roman arch, but it goes up to a point so that weight is channeled at an angle, therefore more goes directly down into the ground. So that this could be taller than previous cathedrals could be. So then out here, this is just another arch, but you have this thing right here. This is called a buttress. It's like a separate little structure that's built on the outside. Like this is open space here. And this heavy stone wall or column thing is built here. And then they would build these at an angle. at a diagonal. And that's, you can see how if you were building with blocks, that would push that wall against the tension of this one pushing out. Because there's some pressure here going out from that height and that arch. But this pushes against it and holds it steady. Now in this particular building, they went even taller. So they added to the sides here, and to give it more strength, they built this pier all the way up tall, which is kind of like another column. Notice it's like telescoping. It gets smaller and smaller, kind of like a shell structure, all stone. And then they have these that are built at an angle going up to do the same thing as the lower one. And these are called flying buttresses. And the reason they're called flying buttresses is because this is open air space right here. They're like just a line, just a just like a little support wall, but it's open. It's not solid. This is not a solid thing, so it's like it's open air. However, it's kind of interesting. You can see there's even a little mini arch right here. So even the buttress is built in that arch style to give it support so it doesn't collapse, because that's tensile strength, right? There's tensile strength even through here. How far can you go before this is wanting to go down? Now this is all Gothic architecture. This is the time period we would call Gothic. And when we go through art history in the next few weeks, we will cover this as a time period of art. And we'll look again at some of these cathedrals and learn some of them, such as Notre Dame Cathedral, right here that you're looking at. Right now we're just looking at them for what they look like, but later we'll learn them more for the historical context of them. Okay, so you can see it just builds on itself. We had the simple arch, then we went on to more complex barrel vaults with naves, and then the groin vault with bays, and then we moved on to taller and taller buildings with these Gothic arches. Pointed arch, I should say. And then the next complicated step is the dome. The structure of some of the world's most famous buildings. A dome is a structure generally in the shape of a hemisphere or half globe, half ball. A drum is often the circular base of a dome building. So this is all built on the same concept, though, of kind of similar to the arch. It's similar but different. And I hope you can look at these and kind of just think about how is the weight of this being distributed. So here's the basic parts. When it says a drum base, that's talking about, try a different color. That's talking about this here at the bottom. It's round, and so it would go around in a circle, but it's kind of like a cylinder, like a drum. And then the dome is built on top of that. So you can see this is called, they don't list these in your vocabulary, but these are like buttresses that support the dome from the outside as well. So it's almost built more like in rings. I'm going to click to the next image just to show you what the inside actually looks like to help give you a visual better. You can see how this has been built in rows of rings. So there was the first row, and then there was the second row. And because of them being slightly shaped differently, getting a little bit smaller and narrower towards the top, it works. It has to be very perfectly calculated to have a shape of square, like these squares that were built in. They would be slightly like that, like they're a little bit narrower at the top than at the bottom. And gradually, as you do that, it gets skinnier at the top. It creates this dome shape. So every row and the top of each box of every row has to be a little bit narrower. And it really is like the same concept to throw back to yesterday's lecture or the previous lecture on coil pots. If you can picture that image of a coil pot going around and around, to get it to go in, you have to put the coils slightly smaller, slightly on the inside edge of the previous one. It's the same idea. Okay, let me go back to the diagram page. So that shows you how it's built in rings. And then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the oculus, which is actually an opening at the top of the ceiling. I'm going to show you back to this image again to help you see the coffering. So coffering is recessions created into a ceiling which help lessen the weight. It's decorative, it's got repetition, it's got lines and interest, so it's doing a lot aesthetically, but these are like chunked out. They're strongest around the outside because it's thick, but then there's less and less stone as it goes in, and that lessens the weight. It's just a way of getting some of the weight out of the dome. What if this was just solid rock? It'd be extremely heavy. Well, it is extremely heavy, but it'd be, I don't know, at least twice as heavy if it had all of these filled in solid. So that's coffering. The portico is usually the front, kind of like the entrance to a building, which we'll see in the next slide. You may have already noticed it. And this is, what kind of structure is this? Post and lintel, right? You've got your posts, and then you've got your cross beams. And the rotunda would be this area. Rotunda is a round building, just this space basically. So when we look at this image again, that would be the interior is the rotunda. If you go to a Capitol where they have an arched dome top on many of the capitals in the United States have it, they call that, it's called the rotunda, the middle of it, like all this open domed area. So this is the Pantheon in Rome. And the Romans perfected this engineering genius of the dome, just like all the other engineering feats that have stood the test of time and are thousands of years old. When you see it on the inside like this, the Pantheon has a perfect hemispherical dome soaring 142 feet above the floor, resting upon a cylinder, which is like that drum I told you about, almost exactly the same diameter, 140 feet. So it's as tall as it is wide. The dome is made of concrete. I kept saying rock, but it's concrete, which would have been applied over wooden centering erected in the interior, though exactly how this centering was constructed remains a mystery. So they would have had like things built up here in the center and around the edges, I guess, to help them construct that. The ceiling is coffered, ornamented with recessed rectangles, and as I told you, coffers lessen the weight, only about 2 feet thick at its highest point. The dome increases dramatically in thickness towards the base as a series of step rings appear on the outer surface. The rings add weight to the base of the dome and increase its stability. At the very top, the dome has an opening of 29 feet in diameter at the oculus, thought to be symbolic of the eye of heaven. This opening provides the sole illumination for the building. That's where the most light comes in, and it does plenty. It really lets the light shine in and illuminate that room. You can see in the picture, it really does. It doesn't have windows, does it? So that has to be the sole way that the light is coming in. In its conception, then, the Pantheon is amazingly simple, equal in height and width, symmetrical in its structure, round form set upon top round form. Yet because of its scale and its satisfying proportions, the effect is overwhelming. The Romans were able to set up huge spaces such as this without any interior supports. And if you think about that, that's a pretty huge feat. Whereas Greek and Egyptian buildings have been made of solid stone, monumental Roman buildings were made of thick concrete, tamped down into parallel brick walls as though into a mold, then faced with stone veneer to look as though they were made of solid stone. An important technological breakthrough, the use of concrete cut costs and enabled building on a grand scale. Okay, and then a little more on the dome. So minarets are slender towers often seen on the outside of mosques. Pendatives, their function is to make a smooth transition between a rectangle and a dome in a building. And corbelling, each row of stones extends slightly beyond the one below until eventually the opening is bridged and can be used in arch, vault, and dome constructions. So let's see if we can see that happening a little bit here. So these are the pendatives. Do you see how they can hold up the dome? And they make a transition between the rectangle and a dome in a building. And then, as I said before, this is like the Pantheon. So you have the dome base, or excuse me, the drum base with the dome sitting directly on top of it, just like this. This is the drum base down here with the dome on top. And in this style, you have a square base. These would be two different styles with these pendatives holding up the dome. And we're going to look at an example of that in just one second. So corbelling is just this, the idea of it gradually going out to meet. Each row of stones extends slightly beyond one until eventually the opening is bridged. Just like I was talking about with the coil pot. Like it has to, you can't go too fast at making it smaller or you'd have a point, you'd have a cone shape. To get this very graceful, perfectly calculated symmetrical arch, it has to be so slowly increased to get that effect of a dome. So that's what corbelling is. Each row getting smaller, skinnier. And I'll show you an example of these minarets that's not in the diagram here. Slender towers often seen on the outside of mosques. So the next image is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And so this is an example of the second diagram, this one, where you have a square base, the pendatives, and the dome sitting on top. You can very clearly see the square base here. Then you have these work as pendatives, this area right in through here. You can't really see it because it's kind of made into a square, but that works like a pendative. And then you have this little bit of space here where there's some windows, and those are actually almost serving more like flying buttresses. They are little supports there that hold the dome on top. You have these big arches on all four sides. We can only see this one on this side, but this originally was designed by two mathematicians, Anthemius and Tralles. Hagia Sophia was built as a church during the 6th century when Istanbul, then called Constantinople, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So it was built as a Christian church. When the Turks conquered the city in the 15th century, Hagia Sophia was converted for use as a mosque. It was the first time that the four slender towers, the minarets here, these, were added. The building is now preserved as a museum. In sheer size and perfection of form, it was the architectural triumph of its time and has seldom been matched since then. This is an interior rendering. It's actually a lithograph of what the inside might look like at the main dome spot. And here on the inside, we can very clearly see the pendentives, how those are like supporting the dome, how it transitions from a square base, do you see that, to up to the dome. On the other side of this, if I'm understanding it right, we have points there. Yeah, that would be like these corners that stick out. So the Pantheon was an example of a drum base. Hagia Sophia was an example of a square base or rectangular base with domes on top. Okay, moving on to the next type of construction, we have cast iron construction, a much more modern form of construction than stone or concrete even. Cast iron construction utilizes a skeleton and skin method. During the 19th century, its usefulness as a structural building was proven. Two very well-known cast iron structures are the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower. And here we see a picture of the Eiffel Tower. Undoubtedly, we all know what that looks like. Created by Alexandre Gustave Eiffel in 1889. It was built for the World's Fair in Paris and an early experiment in cast iron construction. So normally you would have skin over something like this. This one doesn't actually have skin, does it? It's the structure we see is pretty much what it is, the actual skeleton of it. So it is the skeleton. Shows itself without the anything on the outside. Doesn't need it. No marble, no glass, no tiles, no skin of any kind. Just the clean lines drawn in an industrial age product. Okay, and then the next type is balloon frame construction. Balloon frame construction utilizes a skeleton and skin method as well. Let me make sure I showed you. I'm going to go back to the cast iron construction. I want to make sure you got that definition down because we go through these a little quicker. So a cast iron normally would be a skeleton and skin, and it allowed for tremendous height or much higher than we had before, using these iron cast beams. And then just to clarify, this is the Eiffel Tower, but it doesn't have skin, but that is an example of cast iron construction. Again, pretty much for aesthetic purposes, right? And then back to this one. So balloon frame construction is also skeleton and skin. The builder first develops a framework by nailing boards together, then adds a roof, the sheaths the walls, or covers the walls. Two innovations caused the development of balloon frame construction: improved methods for milling lumber and mass-produced nails. So this is really what we think of. We're getting from very elaborate, marvelous, amazing architecture down to a little more everyday here. This is what you would think of as houses. We call them stick-built houses, where you have the wooden structure underneath. You add a roof, you cover the walls with plywood, and then some other sort of skin. And this is how most houses are built. I don't really actually didn't give you an example of that, but if you can just picture, you've seen houses being built, modern day stick built houses with a wooden construction and then the covering over that. Okay, steel frame construction utilizes a skeleton and skin also. Each lower story supports those above it. The builder creates a steel cage, a skin of some other material is sheathed over it, and skyscrapers are this method. The steel, the innovation of using steel as the frame is the big reason these can be so tall. Iron is a lot heavier, and so not able to get the height with iron as with steel. With this steel frame construction, you had to have elevators, right? So that was an innovation caused by this development. So if you kind of think of these last three, we have cast iron construction. The main material is iron, allowed for bigger, higher buildings, very expensive to build. And then you have balloon frame construction, which is the main material is wood. These would not be for enormous buildings. These are more for residential houses. And then you have steel frame construction. So steel is the main material, iron, wood, steel. And these are the ones that allow for the tallest of buildings, the biggest buildings. So here we go. This is the Lever House in New York. So let me describe what you're seeing here. This is like the bottom of the building. It's actually supported underneath by columns. So it's almost like a post and lintel understructure there. And it has the actual steel building built directly on top of this lower piece. You can have, I was just looking up what is underneath there. It's plazas and passageways beneath the building. And really no other system of construction except for steel frame could have made this possible to have this kind of floating form. And one thing to note about this steel frame construction is also the way in which they're built. So it is a skeleton and skin, but it's not like this was built and then this was built and then this was built. It's not like the stepped construction. It's the entire frame was built within the skin put on top of that. This was kind of like this building built in the 50s. Was very innovative and interesting and liked for its sleekness and height. And it just kind of echoes the way things were going at that time, that when we weren't spreading out anymore, we were going up as a country. Then we have suspension and cable stayed structures. So we're going to look at a couple bridges here. Suspension is a structural method made possible by steel. Cables run vertically to a main steel cable, which sags on a parabolic curve between vertical support pylons driven into the ground. So I'll click over and show you. A good example of this is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, built in 1937. And this is a suspension structure. As that definition said, you have these vertical pylons built into the ground. You have these big support cables in a parabolic curve, draping from top to top. So think about how the weight is distributed on that. Think about how where these are attached, the strength that then these have on them. And then you have all these vertical cables going down and then they're attached to the actual road bridge part that's being held, the horizontal part there. And go back to the other slide now. Cable stayed structures. combine piers with suspender cables, or we call those stays. Piers with suspender cables. The suspenders rise on an incline towards the towers. So where we had the Golden Gate Bridge was a series of vertical cables, other than the one parabolic kind of curved cable that goes from tower to tower, from pylon to pylon. Now we have these piers. All of the weight is on these piers going clear to the top, and then all of these cables are attached to the pier, and then going down at different intervals and angles attached to the roadway to hold that up. So this is an example of a cable stayed structure. Okay, one more type of architecture, or several more actually, but another one. Reinforced concrete. So reinforced concrete relies on iron rods embedded into wet concrete. The iron adds tensile strength, while the concrete provides shape and surface, allowing for a wide variety of structures and shapes. And one of the best well-known of these reinforced concrete architecture types is the Sydney Opera House in Australia, built in 1959 to 72. So when this was constructed, it would have had iron rods forming the shapes, and then the wet concrete on the iron rods, which actually I guess you would have had to have like a big form of some kind to form this almost like a mold for the concrete, and then the concrete on top, and then you put the iron rods into the wet concrete, as it says. They're embedded into the wet concrete. And so the iron in that concrete, as you can imagine, creates a lot of tensile strength. Like it can hold its own weight up a lot better than if it was just plain concrete. It might crack and fall down. So you can just really be creative in the shape, right, of the structure of that. There's not really anything holding you back. It's almost sculptural when you're using concrete. It's like using clay, in a sense, to form it to whatever shape you want. And we would consider this a shell construction, because even though it has two materials in it, it has concrete and iron rods. It's not like the iron rods are there and then the concrete's on top of that. They are together as one thing. So it's kind of like that is it. That is the structure itself, is this iron and concrete forming. So we would consider that a shell structure. Just to clarify one thing, like the lever house would be definitely skeleton and skin. Everything we've been talking about, most of this has been skeleton and skin, these last few examples. As I said, this is skeleton and skin. These are kind of like the Eiffel Tower. They're like skeleton with no skin on top. Skeleton, no skin. So we can, because they're bridges, they're not buildings. They serve a different purpose. But just to clarify, kind of always, every time we talk about a new construction, it's good to think, wait, is that skeleton and skin, or is that shell? And the big thing is, if it's shell, it's going to be made out of one material. In this case, it's two materials, but I explained that. A log cabin would be an example of a shell as well. Yes, it's built with the side walls and then the roof put on top, but the whole thing is made out of wood, right? So a log cabin is an example of shell. And here's an interesting example of architecture. This is an example of reinforced concrete also. A little different type of thing than the Sydney Opera House, but this is by a very famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and the title of this house is Falling Water, 1936. Wright's goal was to create architecture that was reflective and sort of embedded into and not hindering or taking away from nature, but just becoming part of nature. So he purposely built this with the waterfall, and in fact, it is built over the waterfall. So the water goes under the house. And then you have these large things protruding out. So these, I'll draw on it, I'll show you. These are what we would call cantilevers. So you want to make sure you get that in your notes. This is called a cantilever. It is something that projects out and it's only supported at one end. So it's a little hard to see in this picture, but down here, this is where it's attached to the house, down here. And I don't know what that red line is. And then it's sticking out this direction. So this is sticking out too. It almost looks in this picture like it's supported all around, but excuse me. It's just attached here at the back side of this big thing sticking out. And there's other, like this is a cantilever, a little one. This is the roof forms a cantilever. I believe this is over here. They're all over it. And it kind of gives the idea of these big flat rocks, how they stick out into space. So he was, again, trying to create a piece of architecture that's at one with nature. And this is an example of organic architecture where it's trying to blend in. And then we have one thing about this that I'd like to say too is it's made out of stone quarried nearby. So conceptually, you know, the thinking behind it and meaning of it is also, it's part of its environment. And it's meant to have unity. There's a principle of design. Unity with the landscape around it. Those are like terraces that come out. We can call those terraces that are the cantilevers. Okay, the next construction type is a geodesic dome. That's basically a bubble-shaped structure created by a network of metal rods arranged in triangles and tetrahedrons. It's a modular system and requires no interior support. And this R. Buckminster Fuller is credited with the invention of the geodesic dome. Okay, so an example of that would be this one, created by the man Fuller. This is the U.S. Pavilion Expo 67. And you can see how it's constructed with these metal triangular shaped beams. It's very much a mathematical type of structure, perfectly round. I know you're probably also thinking of a very well-known one, Epcot Center. They're everywhere. They're used for lots of different things. Sometimes people even build them for homes. But there's like one at a zoo, I think it's the Omaha Zoo, where it's like creates a whole different type of environments for like a desert. So you can walk through it like you're in different types of ecosystems. And the light all comes in that way. These are all, I believe in this one too, all windows, all glass. So the light comes in like that. I just thought of, there's also, I think, a geodesic dome in Las Vegas, like a really new, amazing thing. I might see if I can find an image of that really quick. I'll just show you this little clip of this dome that's in Las Vegas.
You've probably seen what it looks like from the outside, but tonight, ahead of the grand opening, Gotti Schwartz takes us inside the Sphere.
Right off the Vegas Strip is the future of entertainment in a way only science fiction could predict. Some calling it eye-catching. To others, it's out of this world. And when words fail, there's always an emoji. But this 366-foot shimmering exosphere is just the beginning, because what's inside there is even more mind-blowing.
What is your name?
My name's Gotti. And I'm Jim.
Howdy,
We've
I'm
met
Jim.
before.
Welcome to Sphere.
Just beyond 5 Aura robots is a taste of the most baffling sound system in the world. You're isolating each instrument. I'm isolating each instrument into a beat. All of this starting with a simple sketch from Jim Dolan, owner of some of the most storied venues on Earth, who decided to reimagine entertainment with a $2.3 billion gamble in the desert. What was your reaction when you saw it turn on?
Well, I was enchanted too. I mean, it was awesome. We designed it, we visualized it, and it's so big.
And finally, inside the sphere within a sphere, 168,000 square feet of high-definition LEDs, 167,000 speakers, 17,000 seats, and 10,000 of them powered by haptics.
It's impossible to describe, right? It's like trying to explain what a peanut butter and jelly sandwich tastes like to somebody who's never tasted one.
This weekend, U2 claiming the first residency, followed closely by another fully immersive experience called Postcards from Earth, all about this even bigger sphere that we all call home. Gotti Schwartz, NBC News, Las Vegas.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about
Okay, so that's an example of a very modern geodesic dome. Built with the same structure, but then it has all the sheathing over it that has millions of lights and creates it almost looks like a screen, or it does look like a screen from the outside and the inside. Okay, and lastly, we have green architecture. The pursuit of creating healthier and less wasteful human habitat is at the core of green architecture. It's an aspect of a larger concern called sustainable development, which I have the definition for that there. Sustainable development, providing present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to provide for their own needs. There's a lot of things being done in the idea of this green architecture. The mining of the iron and the steel and all the waste that produces and the dangers to the environment cause people and developers to come up with new ways to build and create architecture that is less draining on the environment and hazardous. So here's one example of an architect named Renzo Piano, and this is the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. It's like it is a museum that you can go into, but then as you can see, the top has like a park on top of it. And it, because of that park on top of it, which is a bunch of earth, it's almost like a,
addition to the Las Vegas skyline. You've probably seen what it looks like from the outside. But tonight, ahead of the grand opening, Gotti Schwartz takes us inside the sphere.
Right off the Vegas Strip is the future of entertainment in a way only science fiction could predict. Some calling it eye-catching. To others, it's out of this world. And when words fail, there's always an emoji. But this 366-foot shimmering exosphere is just the beginning, because what's inside there is even more mind-blowing.
What is your name?
My name's Gotti.
And
I'm Jim.
Howdy, I'm Jim. Welcome to Sphere.
Just beyond 5 Aura robots is a taste of the most baffling sound system in the world. You're isolating each instrument.
I'm isolating each instrument into a beat.
All of this starting with a simple sketch from Jim Dolan, owner of some of the most storied venues on Earth, who decided to reimagine entertainment with a $2.3 billion gamble in the desert.
What was your reaction when you saw it turn on?
Well, I was enchanted too. I mean, it was awesome. We designed it, we visualized it, and it's so big.
And finally, inside the sphere within a sphere, 168,000 square feet of high-definition LEDs, TVs, 167,000 speakers,
the glass
17,000 seats,
for
and
maximum
10,000 of them
clarity and to
powered by
minimize heat
haptics.
absorption.
It's impossible to
Photosensors
describe.
automatically
Right. It's
adjust
like trying to
artificial
explain
lights in
what a
response
peanut
to
butter and
natural
jelly
light
sandwich
levels.
tastes like
Office
to somebody
windows
who's never
open so that
tasted one.
employees can
This
inhale fresh
weekend,
air.
U2 claiming
In
the
visitor
first
area,
residency,
automated
followed closely by
ventilation
another
system
fully
regulates
immersive
building
experience
temperature.
called Postcards
Louvers
from Earth,
open to let the
all
cooling
about this
air,
even bigger sphere that we all
from the
call
park,
home.
and the skylights
Gotti
on the open
Schwartz,
roof
NBC News,
to
Las
allow
Vegas.
hot air to escape.
Thanks for
During
watching.
the
Stay
winter,
updated
radiant
about
heat from hot water pipes embedded in the concrete floor keep warmth where it's needed. Reclaimed city water is used for the toilets, and low-flow fixtures throughout conserve water. Attention to environmental concerns extended to the materials the building was made from, which include recycled steel and lumber harvested from sustainable yield forests. Much of the insulation is made from recycled blue jeans, and concrete contains fly ash and slag, which is an industrial byproduct that formerly went to waste. So this is a great example of all that green architecture is trying to encompass, and that's for all types of buildings that they, including residential, searching to find ways to build in a more effective way to help our environment. Okay, and I think that's it for today's lecture. Let me go back to the main beginning screen. We went through all of these types of systems and construction types. Covers a wide range of time periods and regions of the world, innovation, and I hope that gives you an overall view of architecture. And as I said, this is our last chapter for this section. We will be having a test over chapters 10 through 13. So your instructor will be giving you a study guide for these 10, 11, 12, and 13, 4 chapters. And then there'll be a test following that.